Hello everyone, a special welcome to the students, agents and prospective Australians watching out there. Today we'll be discussing one of the most common questions that we receive as migration agents or solicitors as the case may be, and that is, when can I expect an invitation, whether it's for 189, 190 or another comparable scheme? Now, I will preface this by saying we're assuming a base level of knowledge about general skilled migration and similar schemes, but to jump right into it, this is definitely one of the most deceptively complex questions out there. Now, the mistake that we see many applicants make is to assume that invitation is just a matter of getting your point score, lodging your EOI or whatever it is, nomination, and it spits out an invitation at some predefined point. Now, the reality is the scheme doesn't operate in that way. It's not a mechanical system. It's not just about ticking the boxes. There is a lot more that goes into it, which frustrates a lot of people who come to us expecting, a black and white answer, 2 months, 6 months, a year, never, whatever it is. Now, definitely there are some people who are very likely to receive an invitation very quickly, but oftentimes it can be extremely difficult to estimate, and basically we're left with extrapolating from previous data. So look, we'll go through this the best we can and try to give everyone out there a bit of an idea of how the scheme works behind the scenes and why this question is so difficult to give a straight answer to. So which subclasses are we looking at here? Now, if you're here, you probably already are aware of this, but essentially we're talking about subclass 189, subclass 190, and subclass 491. These are the three main subclasses that operate through an invitation type system. Now, they're not the only ones, but these are by far the most common and the most commonly requested or inquired about by our clients. So the first one I'm going to look at is 189, which is both probably the most intuitive and also the most competitive of the three. Not to say that the other two don't have their advantages. In terms of eligibility, it is the most restrictive insofar as occupations are concerned, but invitations are basically exclusively based on points. Yes, the quotas fluctuate, but because it is comparatively more transparent in terms of the process, it's easier to get a handle on when you can expect an invitation, or, in more recent times, the more pressing question, if you can obtain an invitation, as we will soon see. So now we're looking at 190. Now there's a lot of overlap between 190 and 491 because they both operate on this nomination system. So it's not just the invitation. First of all, you need to apply to be nominated by either a state or territory. Now, the advantage of this subclass is that it is open to a broader range of occupations. Many occupations are specific to certain states or territories, but the disadvantage is you are contending with a separate list of prerequisites set by each individual specific state or territory. So you may have an occupation that's not eligible for 189, but eligible for nomination in, say, the state of Queensland. However, you may not meet the Queensland nomination criteria. So essentially, this requires a lot more forethought in terms of planning your migration pathway in order to ensure that that nomination is viable. This is also direct permanent residency, unlike the 491, but it does require you to commit to a particular state or territory, which is also a very important consideration moving forward. Now, it's easy for us to say as migration agents or solicitors, just bite the bullet. If you have to go somewhere you don't want to be for a couple of years, just do it. But for some people, it's either Melbourne, Sydney or bust. So that's something to definitely keep in mind. 491 operates very similarly to 190. Many states will have specific requirements for 491, either differing from the 190 criteria or supplementary thereto. Often it's concessional. But again, the main advantage here is it's a different set of occupations that are eligible. So if you don't fit into the other two, you might fit into this one. The specific issue with this one is that it isn't direct permanent residency. Currently, it is a provisional visa, which will allow you to transition to permanent residency later down the line, which means you're heavily committed to not only living in a particular state, but also residing in a regional area. Once again, you have to understand that, look, the purpose of this visa is to encourage decentralization, to have skilled migrants settle in these areas that are desperate to have people. A lot of these areas have been devastated by over-centralization, a drought of youth, a drought of skilled young people. Many of them are basically glorified retirement villages, sorry to say, but it really is designed to try and keep you in a regional area for at least a couple of years. So common to all three subclasses is this notion of the points test. So for the students out there, this is located in Schedule 6D of the migration regulations, and it basically helps rank prospective applicants in order of their attractiveness as skilled migrants. It's an uncompromising system, but it is central to our scheme and something that we have to contend with. Now, we won't discuss it in too much detail, but we do have a separate video. I highly recommend you give it a watch, simply because there are some nuances to some of these categories, and oftentimes we have people who are off by 5 or 10 points, which in the grand scheme of things is actually highly determinative as to your prospects long term. So just keep in mind, points test, important. Most of us are aware of it, but just flagging it for the uninitiated amongst us. So when we're looking at 189, what determines when we get an invitation? Now, the mistake a lot of people make is they think it's just about a point score. It's not just about a point score. It's a point score and a quota system. So essentially how this works, the federal government has a quota at the beginning of each financial year. That is apportioned throughout the months. The first few months of the financial year usually have the biggest intake, and then essentially each intake, the highest point scorers are invited. People who are lower down the totem pole may never be invited or may have to wait a while to basically catch up. So the two most determinative factors are, first of all, how many points you have. That's the most important thing. So if you have 120 points, you can expect an invitation very, very quickly in most cases. If you have 65 points, you're probably not going to see an invitation before the EOI expires. Now, that being said, it's always important to keep in mind that you have to be in it to win it. The other thing to keep in mind is that not all occupations operate in the same way. Some have pro rata limitations, which essentially operate to make them particularly competitive because it does limit how many of those people can actually get an invitation in a year. Now, another factor to remember is that when you lodge your EOI is also important. Now, this is when you last lodge your EOI. So don't think that you can maximize your points at the later stages and then expect to move up the queue. So essentially, if two people have the same amount of points, the first or the older of the two EOIs will usually get the invitation. That's our understanding anyway. So looking at the 11th of April 2020 invitation round, we can sort of see how what we discussed operates in practice. So for this particular invitation round, we're looking at a minimum of 95 points to actually receive an invitation. So we can also see on the other side how the number of invitations issued each month fluctuated. Now, this particular financial year is a bit of an outlier, but we can still see that the April invitation rounds abysmally small, which explains why there was such a high minimum point score. So you can see here demand plus quota plus competitive point score system, how this can all contribute to when you get your invitation. So one thing that you sometimes hear from people is that, well, if you just wait long enough, you'll get an invitation. So I've had this personally. I have 65 points. If I just wait long enough, eventually it will come through. Yes, if everyone else stops lodging EOIs, maybe. But ultimately, if people keep lodging EOIs with higher point scores than you, you're never going to be at the front of the queue. So unless you have an obscenely large intake, which I don't think is very likely, you're not going to see an invitation at 65 or even 70 points. And definitely at the latter stages, when the minimum was 60, no one was getting invited at 60. So now we ask the question, when do I get my invitation? And the answer is, it depends. First of all, how many points do you have? How competitive are those points in comparison to other people? I mean, if you're not competitive, then there'll be too many people ahead of you in the queue and you'll never see that invitation. Also, how many invitations are being offered for both the year and whichever particular invitation you're actually looking at. And also, is your occupation one of these pro rata occupations, which means is it an occupation that even a smaller defined number of people are actually able to be invited for each year? And lastly, kind of as a last ditch, when did you lodge your EOI with your current points score? Which is usually just a bit of a tiebreaker mechanic more so than anything else, but it's still something that could mean the difference in an edge case. So what do we mean when we talk about pro rata occupations? Simply put, some occupations have a separate cap as to how many people are able to be invited for those occupations in a given year. The practical effect of this is that oftentimes pro rata applications will have higher minimum point scores to be invited than other general occupations in the system. So here's a list of all the current pro rata occupations. Now the point score ascribed next to them, take that with a grain of salt. Perhaps that was the case in the month that we were looking at just now, but of course that's always subject to change. But you can definitely see that the minimum across all occupations was 95. For some select occupations, it was slightly higher. So now to address some of the common inquiries that we receive explicitly. And the first one is, of course, the one that inspired this video, namely, can you accurately predict how many points you'll need? The answer is no. Well, no with some caveats. First of all, you can definitely say to someone, you know what, you're in a good position to receive an invitation. You're competitive. Past data indicates that people with your point score in your occupation are getting invited. You have a good shot. On the other hand, you can also say to some people, you know what, this isn't enough. It's not going to be enough. It's not likely to be enough, bar some monumental change in the level of demand for permanent residency. So you can basically give a clearly yes and a clearly no, but there's an enormous amount of grey, and even the yes is speculative. You're really extrapolating from past data. Now, is there a magic number of points that will guarantee me an invitation? Again, no. Now, you can say fairly safely that if you have the maximum possible amount of points in an occupation that's not pro rata occupation, you may get an invitation instantly if you're the only person with that point score and there is no limitation on that occupation being invited. So no, there's no magic number, but there is a number that is so high that you're likely to outcompete anyone else with a pending EOI. Now, the third one is something that can stuff you up a long time, and it's something that we've seen, and it's something that's very difficult to fix after the fact. Can I submit an EOI now claiming points I don't have yet? No, just don't do it. Just don't do it. Because when you actually get your invitation on that basis, and you submit your application, and it becomes evident that you didn't have the full points that you claimed at the time you claimed them, then your invitation is basically wasted, your application is put in jeopardy, and there can be wide-reaching consequences in the long term. Now, the last one is, if I have low points, will I get an invitation if I just wait long enough? No. Well, no, but you never know, basically. So what I mean by that is, from a practical perspective, if your point score is at the minimum, if you're lodging an EOI with 65 points, demand is such that there's always going to be more people with higher point scores jumping ahead of the queue, and you're unlikely to ever receive an invitation. It is not a matter of just waiting. If you're not competitive and the demand for the visa remains high, you will be outcompeted for every invitation round, bar, again, some monumental collapse in demand. So now we turn to 190. Now, the advantage of 190 is that there are a greater variety of occupations that might be eligible. The disadvantage is you have to contend with the nomination requirements, which, as we'll see, can be quite onerous for a great deal of applicants. So what goes into a 190 invitation? Long story short, your nomination. Once you're nominated, you're likely to receive an invitation. But you still need 65 points. Some states, such as South Australia, may have additional pathways for higher point scorers. How competitive other applicants are in terms of points claimed, this isn't as determinative as with 189. You also need to look at the demand for your skills in the nominating state. and satisfaction of any nomination-specific requirements. That nomination-specific requirements, is really the most important thing to consider. And in some instances, this is more of a procedural thing, but you may need to accept the nomination offer. So Western Australia is the best example. So the last thing you want to do is not be aware of this, get the Western Australian nomination, go, hey, nice email, go check if you get your invitation, and just wait until the nomination lapses. So Western Australia requires you to actually accept the nomination before it goes through, and once you do that, then you get the invitation. So 190, it's very difficult to know exactly when you'll be nominated. Now, point scores do play a role, but to what extent they play a role is a bit difficult to say in all instances. Generally speaking, if you meet the nomination requirements, you're in with a chance at least. And we do have some data put forward to us through Freedom of Information that gives us some indication on how many points invitees or nominees had at the point they received their invitation. So here we have data from the first quarter of the 2019 to 2020 financial year. This is aggregate data. I can't attest to the accuracy, but essentially this gives us some indication on the minimum point score required for various occupations to be nominated in New South Wales and Victoria. So you can see here, compared to 189, there is an enormous amount of variance. I mean, accountants being invited with 65 points, something's going on there. Maybe you want to have a crack at it. So it might be worth it, even if it seems hopeless. If you're eligible for state nomination, it might be worth submitting a nomination application. In the end, you've got to be in it to win it. Victoria, similarly, there is a lot of variance there. Just keep in mind that they have their own internal processes. It's not just most points or bust. Here we see similar data for Northern Territory and Tasmania. The reason why we extracted this is because a lot of applicants come to us thinking that Northern Territory and Tasmania are a good last-ditch attempt to obtain permanent residency. And in terms of point score, you might be tempted to think that it is, because if you look at what we have here, this is for the calendar year 2019, we have some very competitive pro-rata occupations being nominated by the territory and the state with very, very low point scores. Very quickly, 491, mechanism is very similar. States will have specific requirements for 491. Generally, you'll have to reside in a regional area for a couple of years and then transition to permanent residency, just like the precursor visa, which left us in November of 2019. So now we get to the meat of the matter in regards to 190 and 491, which are the nomination requirements. And this is usually the biggest hurdle. Yes, okay, maybe your occupation is eligible, maybe you have decent point score, maybe 75, 80 points, and then you hit a wall here. So we need to go through these one by one and really understand what each state requires. These are always changing, always changing. So whatever we say here may be different in the new financial year or may be amended at any point hereafter. So first we'll look at New South Wales, one of the most prolific inviters and one of the most popular options for people seeking nomination. So the first requirement here is really quite a common one amongst all the states and territories. The last thing these jurisdictions want is for you to just use their nomination as a means to an end. So this is particularly the case for slightly less popular or less developed states and territories, but it's also an issue for the larger ones as well. They want people who want to live in their state. They don't want people who want their PR in order for them to basically go away and live somewhere else. So if you're currently residing in an Australian state other than New South Wales, you can't apply for New South Wales nomination. If you're residing offshore, you need to have a genuine job offer. So this is another common thing you'll see. Offshore applicants actually having an easier time of it comparatively than people onshore in a different state. So yes, getting a job offer whilst overseas, bit of a hard ask, a tall order, but it's very much preferable to a flat prohibition. So that's something to keep in mind. Of course, if you're already in Australia, moving isn't such a big deal. Now, some occupations require 6 months of residency in New South Wales and 1 year of employment in New South Wales. This sort of goes to the fact that the states have and the territories have a lot of discretion in terms of how they set their requirements, which means a lot of occupations may have special requirements. All other occupations requiring either residing in New South Wales or offshore for 6 months or 1 month of employment in New South Wales. So again, you can see certain occupations have more stringent requirements, and then everything else has a more reasonable requirement. Now, New South Wales does not currently nominate for 491. As of the time of recording, they do for a very specific cohort of prospective applicants, but generally speaking, most people aren't going to be looking at this stage, simply because New South Wales, after the introduction of this subclass and the abolition of the previous, has taken some time in determining what their internal processes are. So there's a little bit of ambiguity there as to how the state wants to deal with those regional nominations. So now we're looking at Victoria, a very prolific inviter or nominator of prospective applicants. Now, they are a little bit stringent in terms of that skilled aspect of skilled migration, but they're nevertheless perhaps one of the more popular avenues to seek nomination. Now, the first thing, we can see a bit of contrast between Victoria and New South Wales. If you're in another state or territory, you just need a job offer. It's not a flat prohibition. Now, of course, you can always move, but there's no flat prohibition there. Occupations carry additional English work experience or specialisation requirements. This is the main bottleneck. So oftentimes you'll see for many occupations you need between 3 to 5 years of professional experience, which is where a lot of prospective applicants get knocked out. So the whole do your student visa, get your temporary graduate visa and then apply for nomination isn't going to cut it in most cases. There is also a separate pathway for PhD graduates. The main advantage is that there are a broader range of occupations that are available, and you need to show settlement costs. So you're not paying this to anyone, you're just proving that you have it so you can show that you can afford to make the move. Separate application procedures for ICT, nursing and engineering and building occupations. So essentially for those occupations that are particularly common in terms of nomination applications, there's a streamlined application process. But if you're having your application dealt with by a professional, that's not something you should really worry about. The next most prolific nominator is the state of Queensland. Very much like New South Wales, if you're in a different state or territory, you're going to have to move. If you're overseas, there's a special stream, but the availability is quite poor. Now, Queensland does have a flat living and working requirement. If you're going for the regional visa, the 491, that's 3 months in a regional area. If you're going for 190, that's 6 months basically anywhere. Now, if you are overseas, as I said, you do need to have a job offer from an employer, which can be a hard ask if you're looking for that job offer whilst overseas. Queensland is also one of the first states we'll look at that divides their nominations into various streams. So this working in Queensland, you need to have a job offer for at least 12 months. If you're offshore, we've already discussed that. Postgraduates, if you've completed a master's or PhD in Queensland, you may be eligible for this. And the small business owner pathway, this is very unique to Queensland. So essentially, if you spend $100,000 to buy a business and you are operating for at least 6 months, you might look at nomination. Still need an occupation though, so don't think of it as a substitute for business skill migration. But if you've got money to invest and you want to go be an entrepreneur in rural Queensland, that option's there for you too. So now we look at South Australia. Now again, doesn't want you living in a different state or territory. Even if you're offshore, if you've lived in a different state or territory for at least in the last 10 years, then you're only eligible for 491. Now why? Well, basically because 491 is a provisional visa, which means you'll have to live in that South Australian area for a number of years before you can transition to 191. So this is basically an insurance policy for those who South Australia is a little bit suspicious of with regards to simply using the nomination as a means to an end. This is a theme that's going to continue. Now, if you're currently residing in South Australia, but have lived or studied or worked in another Australian state, you basically need to have worked in South Australia for the last 6 months. Again, same rationale. Minimum of 1 year of skilled work experience required. However, if you've been living there for a while, or if you are a graduate of South Australia with fairly good academic outcomes, then that may be waived. But if you can already get the graduate visa, why not just working a nominated occupation for a year? Again, very much like Victoria, additional English work experience and point score or chain migration requirements apply to some occupations. South Australia maintains a provisional list, which has a number of special streams. So some occupations may allow sort of a concessional eligibility on the basis of having high points under the points test, or perhaps a chain migration scheme whereby if you have a relative settled there, it also makes your life a little bit easier. So now these are some of the states that are a little bit stingy with their number of nominations issued. As you can see, the fact that South Australia issues more nominations than Western Australia may raise a few eyebrows. But as we'll see, these states are a lot more conservative. A particular note at Tasmania and Northern Territory, because of that aforementioned misapprehension that they do offer sort of a convenient last-ditch option. So now we look at Western Australia, which, whilst more populous than Tasmania and South Australia, issues the fewest nominations of any state. You can say that's largely because the requirements are more restrictive, but really they are a little bit conservative. Western Australia, like Queensland, has numerous cohorts, Western Australian graduates on one hand, and those applying under the general stream. So clearly the graduates, as you may expect, have concessional requirements, meaning they have an easier time of it. Now, whilst there's no need to have lived in Western Australia, in practice, the other requirements do impose the same thing in a different form. General applicants must show either 1 year of Australian work experience or 3 years of overseas work experience in their nominated occupation. Now, this has got to be post-qualification, so you need to have your qualification and then your work experience, and they only look at the last 10 years, which is usually not an issue. Furthermore, general applicants need to have evidence of a job offer. Position must be in Western Australia, closely related to the nominated occupation, and the engagement has to be for at least 12 months. We need to show that it's likely to persist for at least 12 months. Graduates, in comparison, must complete a Western Australian qualification at Certificate 3 or higher, and you need to have studied in Western Australia for at least 2 years. Now, where they differ from the general stream is that they must either have 6 months of Australian work experience or have a 6-month employment contract. So the experience requirement and the employment requirement are less onerous. And the other thing to keep in mind that Western Australian graduates nominating regional-only occupations will be subject to criteria more or less comparable to the general stream. Finally, you need to have proof of savings, again, very much like Victoria. These scale depending on whether or not you have a partner, how many children are coming with you, and are basically there to establish that you can afford the settlement costs of residing in Western Australia. So now we look at Tasmania, which, interestingly, although the whole state is considered regional in most circumstances, they will prioritise people with certain sorts of occupations where the applicant is willing to live outside of the Greater Hobart area. So they really want to prioritise spreading out, decentralising in terms of the state's population. So there are 3 categories of nomination. So like Queensland, like Western Australia, they separate their nomination into streams. So category 1 are for basically Tasmanian graduates, and they basically just need to live in Tasmania for 2 years and continue to live in Tasmania. Category 2 applicants must be living and working in Tasmania for at least 6 months, and your employer has to have been operating in Tasmania for the past 12 months. So no convenient startups, basically. Category 3 is for overseas applicants. Very, very few of these are issued. They're currently closed. Who knows where that's going, whether or not the criteria will change in the new financial year. So watch this space, I would say. So when it comes to the Northern Territory, again, as I've said numerous times, many prospective applicants view it as an easy fix. some sort of concession that they can make to get PR. If I just put up with it and live in Darwin, I can get my permanent residency. What they don't realise is that no participating jurisdiction should not be seen as an easy fix for your migration ambitions. Northern Territory issues the fewest nominations of any participating jurisdiction. To qualify for 190, you have to be applying from within Australia and have lived and worked in the Territory for 2 years. Now, to qualify for 491, it's more or less the same, live and work, but only for 6 months. Now, if you are outside of Australia, you basically need a job offer. Now, some people will say, no, you don't, you just need to show strong prospects of employment. Well, look, the best evidence of prospects for employment is employment, funnily enough. It's also important to note that occupations may impose additional requirements, particularly in terms of the nature of any job offer or English proficiency. So for some occupations, the job offer must meet additional criteria. Much like Western Australia, applicants need to evidence available savings for settlement costs. And finally, you need to evidence through writing a written statement your commitment to the Northern Territory. Applicants who have, this is very unusual, but applicants who have previously applied for nomination in another jurisdiction must additionally provide a statement explaining why you now seek a Northern Territory nomination and why you no longer wish to reside in the other jurisdiction. So again, this plays into that state and territory paranoia about exploiting the system to basically get your nomination and leave, which for many people inquiring about Northern Territory nomination is probably correct. So the Territory is probably very wise to be wary of this. So finally, we have the Australian Capital Territory, or ACT. The ACT system is perhaps the most complex, involving almost like a separate internal points priority system that they usually refer to as the Canberra matrix. Those who satisfy other requirements and score the most points on the matrix are most likely to receive a nomination, funnily enough. Firstly, if you're applying from within Australia but don't live in the ACT, very much like many other states, you can't qualify for ACT nomination. And if you're residing in the ACT, depending on whether or not you're pursuing 491 or 190, you have to be living in the ACT for at least 6 or 3 months, so about 6 months for 190 or 3 months for 491, respectively. You must also work in the ACT for at least 3 months in either case. Overseas applicants must have been overseas for at least 12 months without having any member of their family unit residing in a different Australian jurisdiction. Again, very much like the Northern Territory, don't want the nomination being exploited. So if your partner or your children are in a different Australian state or territory, you're out of luck. Finally, if you're working in the ACT on a temporary skill shortage visa or have lived in the ACT for at least 5 years, there are concessional arrangements. So if you're on a 457 or 482 and living and working in ACT, there's a separate pathway for you there. So now we ask the question, when will I get my invitation? And hopefully now we can see that it's not an easy one to answer. As migration agents, or in the case of visa plan solicitors, it's not our job to divine the future or give a precise timeline. We're here to assess your eligibility, guide you through the process, and try to give you the best chance to achieve your goal. At its core, the skilled migration system is really there to address skill shortages in the Australian labour market. It's not there as some sort of sense of entitlement to give you a clear and concise pathway to permanent residency. If you achieve this visa, it's because you're needed. It's not because you're entitled to it because you studied here, etc. A lot of people come to us and say, look, I got my student visa, I studied here, I graduated, there has to be a pathway. There should be a pathway. My education agent, before I enrolled, said there'd be a pathway, etc., etc. But that's not the purpose of the scheme and not how you should look at it. Securing an invitation depends on a range of factors, as we've said, and some of those are within our control, some of them are not. If you have low points because of your age, you can't make yourself any younger, but you can get NADI accreditation if you're eligible, or you can try to improve your English score. So what we need to do is try to control what's in our power to control and maximise our chances that way. And it's always best to seek independent legal advice, because there may be something that you can do right now that you're not aware of that will give you a significant advantage in achieving your goals. So whilst there can't be any certainty, um, if you have that determination, you have that good guidance and that foundation, that willingness to do what's necessary, and in your capacity to achieve permanent residency, you're going to have the best shot of making that dream come to fruition. So ultimately, seek advice, ask someone who knows, don't throw good money after bad, and make sure that you're on the right track, because the only thing worse than getting advice too late is not getting any advice at all and missing out on an opportunity. Thanks.